Good evening, everyone, and welcome. For those of you that don't know, I'm Professor Rob Mortimer, Pro Vice Chancellor Research and International, and it's my pleasure to start this evening's proceedings for Professor Alex Lowe's inaugural lecture. Alex started his academic journey at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he was awarded a BA in Business Administration. From there, he went on to gain a master's degree in Environmental Management and Geography before completing his PhD at Australian National University. Following a number of appointments across the globe, we were pleased that Alex chose to come to York St John University in February 2024 as Professor in Business and Sustainability in York Business School. Alex describes himself as a human geographer with a strong interest in climate policy and sustainable development. He's gained several awards and scholarships and is currently a panel member of the Research Foundation Flanders, Belgium, as well as being editor of 2 internationally recognised journals. He's published 90 papers since 2008 and is among the world's top 2% scientists, ranked 60th out of 12,841 in the Urban and Regional Planning section of the Stanford Elsevier list. So tonight, Alex will explore China's climate change strategies and policy challenges, and there'll be an opportunity for us to reflect on the emerging opportunity for China following the USA's withdrawal from international climate action and development assistance. So I'm very pleased to hand over to Alex.
Thank you, Professor Mortimer, for giving a very positive introduction. It's my pleasure to join the York St John University and came to do my first public seminar in the UK. As Professor Mortimer has said, before coming to the UK, I worked in Australia, Hong Kong, and New Zealand. After I moved, some people ask me, how do you feel about the life in the UK comparing with Australia and New Zealand, which obviously have many things in common? I will tell you in another date, but the answers won't be surprising. I started as an environmental economist with a strong interest in political science, and I moved closer to human geography with an interest in business and public policy, especially climate policy. But continue to focus on climate change issues because before I came to UK, my last appointment in New Zealand was a sort of climate change focused sort of position. So today's topic is China's climate policy. It was more than 15 years ago, 2010, when I was still doing my PhD, where I started looking into China's climate policy. And over the past 15 years, I have been asked by media many times to comment on China's sort of a climate strategies, and also asked to do some presentation on this topic. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, for non-academic audience mainly, stakeholders, policymakers, and the public. In some cases, some journalists even came to me, I believe, because I am seen as not very close to China, and therefore will tell the truth. I am originally from Hong Kong. Whether you classify as part of China, I think it's up to sort of debate. But they believe, some of them, especially some sort of anti-China media, believe that I will tell the truth. I don't know. But today, I will tell you what I know and believe based on my 15 years of research on this topic. A bit of overview about my presentation today. We'll talk about China's climate policy, and I will talk you through briefly the sort of history, in particular starting from the 90s all the way to the mid-2000s. And then I will focus on more recent developments in the past 2 decades, and focusing on 2 key moments from the mid-2000s. And then I will give you an update about the current progress, major policy programs in China. And then I will finish by looking forward, sort of commenting on what I believed the directions that China's climate policy is heading to. 90s was a critical moment in international climate change debate and negotiations. If you're old enough, you might remember the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997. During that decade, or a few years before the Kyoto, we had the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, and China ratified this convention in 1992. There were a lot of international negotiations back in the 90s, led primarily by Western countries. At that time, China wasn't really the main target. The largest greenhouse gas emitter at that time was the United States. Everyone knew that China is going to be the number one in terms of their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. But the 90s wasn't yet the time where everyone sort of pointing finger at China. So there were some international pressures on China, but I don't think it made a difference to China's policy internally. So China at that time, 90s, there were only three major policy objectives: economic growth, and economic growth. Everything else was not very important. So China didn't really care. And like I said, at that time, Western countries, the international community were sort of yet to be sort of focusing on China. So they were still sort of trying to develop a Western countries lead conventions. And also at that time, internally, China basically managed climate change as a technical issues. Initially, it was as a policy portfolio managed by a meteorological agency. But it's not unique to China. Many countries, including Western countries, took that approach, starting from seeing climate change as a scientific issue, and then later sort of they integrate the issue into much broader economic, macroeconomic planning. The same thing happened in China. Later in 90s, the central government moved the portfolio into the one of the major macroeconomic agency, which is the National Development and Reform Commission, which is a high-level government agencies holding a lot of important portfolios, including economic and social development. 2000, we saw a new climate policy regime forming within China through the formulation and adoption of various national plans, regulations, international agreement, and also institutional arrangements. One of the best examples is about renewable energy, which renewable energy law adopted in 2005, paving the way for the fast growth of renewable energy development that we are seeing over the past 2 decades. In 2006, climate change was written into the formal 5-year plan, which is a very important sort of a medium-term planning document in China. And it was the first time in history where climate change was written into this important strategic document. And also in 2005, internationally, China participated in the United Nations CDM Clean Development Mechanism. And later we know that China eventually pretty much dominated the CDM market under the United Nations sort of a market mechanism. So which means that China started playing a very important role internationally. And within the country, we also saw China started publishing their annual climate change report from 2007, documenting their achievement and plans about climate change. However, it was the time where I started looking into China's climate policy, and I found, not surprisingly, there was a strong focus on energy issue, renewable energy, energy saving and energy efficiency. So, but much less on other climate change mitigation technologies that are not directly related to energy, such as carbon capture, and also climate change adaptation, which I will discuss later today. Now, you might think that China was committed and taking a lot of climate change action. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, the other side of the story is that China at that time continued to pollute, which means that consuming a lot of fossil fuels. And this was quite clear in some of their policies. For example, fossil fuel subsidies continued to rise during that time and actually came to the highest point in 2012. So last time I checked the record, I think it was about 2.4% of their tax revenue being fossil fuel subsidies, which was quite high for China. So I would say at that time, China's climate policy had a very narrow scope, focusing only on certain aspects, especially energy. Now, from 2007, we started seeing changes, not small changes, not specifically about policy. It's more about the system. I identify two key moments from 2007. The first one is a shift in the state of the carbon economy. So earlier I mentioned before in the 90s, perhaps before 2005, the United States was the largest greenhouse gas emitter. And then by 2006 or 7, we realized China is going to surpass the United States to become the largest greenhouse gas emitter a little bit earlier than what we expected. This is extremely important because for a very long time, China and also some other major developing countries defended their moral responsibility, or perhaps trying to shift the moral responsibility for controlling their greenhouse gas emissions to Western countries for a good reason. Because many Western countries, especially the United States, historically contribute to a very large part of the greenhouse gas emission that we found in the atmosphere. But when we came to 2007, we realized China is now the number one, which means that China has lost the moral case for blaming the Western countries for sort of for the problem. For a very long time, China was very hostile to Western countries, calling for controlling their emissions in China. So that's what we've got. If you are old enough to remember the Copenhagen conference in 2009, one of the most important UNFCCC, so climate change summit in our history was 2009. You see the news headline, one of those being sort of a lot of people saying that China trying to hijack the climate change talk and sort of a contributing to the failure of the international negotiations. So there were significant and increasing international pressures, and it's just kind of like exploded at that time, especially in the conference. Now, at that point, China continued to deny, but shortly after, I think they realized that it's quite hard for them to deny the responsibility because they have become the number one greenhouse gas emitter. So they started thinking about, a shift in their approach. And this coincided with another change that you see in the middle, GDP growth declining. If I may jump a little bit to show you a graph. So if you look at that, this is GDP growth, annual growth rate. If you look at 2017, double digit, and then from that point, from that year, coming down to about 10 in 2010, and then 2020, single digit, and that was, I think it was COVID-19, but even in the last couple of years, it remains to be single digit, and you probably won't expect it will go back to double digit in the future. which means this is a strong signal of a long-term decline in their economic sort of output. This is really important, not just in terms of their sort of their GDP, the numbers, but also a signal for a economic restructuring, because they can no longer rely on, for example, manufacturing industry. They would need to think about shifting or putting more emphasis on tertiary industries, or even to look for an alternative growth model that doesn't really focus on strong sort of economic growth. It's just like the path that we follow in the Western world. So it's pretty much happening at the same time in history. 2007, 2009, 2008, the end of the first decade of 2000s. So on one hand, losing the moral case for shifting responsibility. On the other hand, it's time to rethink about their growth model. And then later on, we know that one of their strategies is to turn their focus on some cleaner technology, cleaner sort of economic development, focusing on not just economic growth, but more generally well-being, something that is aligned with sustainability goals. In China, they call it ecological civilization. So this is a shift in their economic model. Successful or not, this is their recent economic strategy, which I believe to be compatible with our climate change objectives. So you can see these two things happen pretty much around the same time. Now, that's not the only key moment in China's recent history. Another one which is quite obvious is that we've got a new president. It was not exactly at the same time. It was a couple years later. In 2012, President Xi Jinping became the president. If you have been following China's sort of news and their stories, you will know that this person is very ambitious, powerful, and he was also able to sort of change some major laws and including the terms of his office. So in theory, he could rule China forever. Good thing or not, I don't know. If you know that I come from Hong Kong, you might know that I have a different story to tell. But in terms of climate change, that's different, because he supported sort of a strong climate change action. And in fact, many ambitious climate change action was introduced after or about the time where he became the president. So it cannot be coincidence. For major policy programs like those I'm going to introduce, must have high top leadership support. So even though this person is controversial internationally, under his sort of a leadership, there are many strong climate change actions. So it's kind of like a change of paradigm. I remember when I did a similar presentations, one person asked me whether China was genuine in taking those strong actions. Well, it doesn't really matter, because we are seeing sort of a big progress. But if you really ask me, I would say probably not. Because for this person, the president, I think his main goal is to take leadership, including global leadership. So why climate change? Climate change is one of the areas that people in the world care about, and at the same time also relatively less controversial for China to lead. You think about some other major policy areas, human rights, or even international trade, those are much more complex and controversial, where climate change is relatively less, all right, at least before the recent sort of right-wing political movement. Now, also, China is in a good position. Remember, China is the #1 climate change greenhouse gas emitter. So if the world is serious about reducing our greenhouse gas or stabilizing our greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere, you got to talk to China. So China is in a good position to take the lead. And also internally, it's not just about leadership, global leadership, but also internally legitimacy. I mentioned economic decline. For a very long time, since the 80s, China relied on promoting economic growth as a way to stabilize the society within China. So think about once the people in China realize that their economy is declining, they won't be happy about it, and they might not give support to the top leadership. So the leadership would have found another area to promote and enhance their legitimacy to rule the country. So instead of just focusing on economic growth, they turn to slightly different but still related well-being, the quality of growth, rather than just the quantity. GDP, for example, per capita is one of the quantitative measure. So promoting growth, well-being, ecological civilization, all of these are compatible with climate change action. So this partly explains the shift in their climate change strategies, timing, change of political leadership, and a change in their growth model. And then we'll talk about the current state of their policy, and also perhaps starting from some statistic. I mentioned China contributed to pretty much the largest share of greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere. If you look at different sort of statistics, you might get slightly different number. Here I've got 28 of our global greenhouse gas emissions coming from China. I think the range should be around 25 to 30, but definitely more than 25, close to 30. And if you look at the second one being the United States, only 15%, all right, much lower than China. So that's what I said. If we are serious about controlling, stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions, China must be part of it. And then, how about per capita? We know that China continues to call itself a developing country. Technically, it is. But if you think about greenhouse gas emission or carbon emission per capita, it's more like sitting between developing and developed countries. So if you look at the table on the left-hand side, on the top, we have China here. It was the most updated data from the International Energy Agency being 2022. So it was just shortly after COVID. It might not be representative, but if you compare those with other countries, 7.5 metric ton CO2s, still several times higher than other major emerging economies, such as Brazil, India, and Indonesia. So even though all of these are major developing countries, China is kind of like standing out by several times more on a per capita basis. So if you think about their contributions, especially the current rather than historical contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, China is doing much worse than other developing countries. And if you compare with other Western countries, it's kind of like sitting between the worst and the better ones. The worst one obviously being the United States and Australia, double digit per capita CO2 emissions. China is obviously much lower than that. But if you compare with some major European countries, including the UK, I think it's a little bit of a mixed picture. A little bit lower than Germany, a little bit higher than Germany, I think it's comparable, but still higher than, for example, the UK and France. So I would say it's kind of like sitting between the global south and global north in terms of its current contributions to the problem. China have introduced quite a lot of major policies, as I mentioned before. Many of these are related to renewable energy. And in fact, this is one thing, and perhaps the most important one, that China has been very proud of. And this, you can see this in data, which is quite obvious. Data from International Renewable Energy Agency, comparing with the more recent statistic. In 2006, I chose this one because it was the time when the renewable energy law was introduced. So you can see the change after that. On the top, renewable energy. Pay attention to what this is referring to: total installed capacity of energy generation, installed capacity, which means the maximum capacity. Whether you actually use the capacity is another issue. So they have the maximum capacity installed. Initially 20%, and then 10 more percent a few years later. And in 2022, 15% more. So you can see the growth. It's kind of like growing much faster in recent years. Now that is installed capacity. It doesn't mean they actually use the capacity to generate electricity. So I always present another sort of set of data, which is exactly what I like to sort of talk about: energy generated from renewable energy. Only if you use renewable energy to generate electricity, then you can replace fossil fuels, resulting in a replacement of the sort of a fossil fuels, resulting in reduction in greenhouse gas emission, where you could build capacity without actually using it, and as a result, without actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Very similar picture, but less significant. Renewable energy, 15%, 2006, 14, 20%, 22%, and then 22, 29%, nearly 40%. A little bit less than double, but if you look at the top, it's much more than double. So still very good sort of indicators, positive, but sometimes it really depends on which data set you look at. There are some other indicators which perhaps we don't have to go through in details, but this is from another source of data showing the investment over the past about 10 years up to 2023. And you can see what I highlight on the top, where the percentage increase over the past, over that 10-year period, was more than 2 times. It wasn't the largest increase. So if you look at, for example, Brazil and even Africa and Middle East, they have a comparable or even better sort of a increase. However, you have to also look at the volume of investment. So you can see in 2023, 273 billion, where if you look at Brazil, it's double digits. So in terms of the volume of investment, it's much bigger than most other countries and even regions. And if you compare with United States and Europe, still much more investment into renewable energy development. And it benefited from several major policies, such as the feed-in tariff, introduced about after the renewable energy law was introduced, and also export some of the clean technologies, especially solar panels. Chances are the solar panels on your rooftop might actually come from China. And they have been quite successful in commercializing this clean technology. So not just serving their own consumption and production, but also exporting. I will come back to this one later. Apart from those technologies, also policy and perhaps political requirements. There have been a lot of top-down requirements from central government asking local and provincial government to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And if you understand the hierarchical system in China, the lower government will have to comply in one way or another. So there's been strong policy signal from the top. And perhaps more importantly, it's not just policy. It's about a system. It's not just about the government doing things to reduce their greenhouse gas emission, but to promote and support industrialization. you might call it green industrialization, turning their not just renewable energy upstream. So those are R&D, for example, but also supporting and strengthening a consumer base downstream, such as electric vehicles. So if you go to China, you'll see a lot of people driving EVs. So that's been very successful in creating demand for renewable energy related sort of a technology and even lifestyles. And also lobby groups, not exactly those sort of a oppositional lobby groups against the government, but more like those working alongside the government to support these policy growths. Mostly sort of those lobby groups related to industry, including and especially state-owned enterprises. So they basically work together. So the whole point is, it's not just a policy change. It is a system change. The whole system has shifted to, I think, for most people at least, a direction that we would like to see. The timing is actually perfect. As I showed you the timeline before, the time where this industry's renewable energy started was about the time where 2007, 2008 and 9, where the international pressures coming to China economy started restructuring, and also new political leadership. So this happened pretty much at the same time. And if, for those who study political science, I think it's something to do also with the political system, top-down system, which I would say is more compatible with greenhouse gas mitigation, especially energy-related sort of policies, because energy, especially energy production, is centralized in many countries, but especially in China, where such a big country with 1.4 or 3 billion of people, there are only 5 major electricity companies and only 2 power grids companies. And they are all state-owned, owned by the state, which means that it's relatively easier for the government, especially central government, to control these companies. Not really control, but to make sure they cooperate. So the top-down approach works quite well, partly because of the nature of greenhouse gas mitigation and also the ways that the political system works in China. And also, renewable energy development in particular is commercially viable, which means that, for example, if you build solar panel, wind turbines, potentially you can generate incomes from the powers that you generate, as some of us do, putting solar panels on our rooftop, supporting industry growth, and also sort of generating profit for the industry. And as a result, the industries, companies are able to grow their own business and in return supporting the policy objectives. So commercially viable and also the centralized nature of energy production all make greenhouse gas mitigation works relatively well in China. So I emphasize relatively because climate policy is not just about mitigation, but also about adaptation. Oh, sorry. So I think I've talked about this. I'm not yet. So these are some major policy programs, which I think I'll just mention them. Low carbon city program since 2010. There have been several, not several, but 81 Chinese cities participating in this policy program. Emission trading scheme starting from 2013 with a national scheme operating since 2021. In the UK, we also have a national ETS as well. And yeah, so renewable energy development is compatible with the new growth model of China. Climate change adaptation is different. Adaptation means preparing for and adjusting to the consequences of climate change, such as flooding, drought. So if you see greenhouse gas emissions as the cause or the reason sort of for climate change to occur, Then climate adaptation means dealing with the consequences, the outcomes. So closely related to each other, but their natures are very different from mitigation. In China, is not particularly a top priority. And in fact, if we think globally, climate change adaptation is relatively underrepresented, especially in our global climate finance. Most of our money goes to renewable and not necessarily renewable energy, but greenhouse gas mitigation. And this is the same in China, where I found some sort of a numbers, which was quite consistent with the global statistic, where CCA, climate change adaptation, receives US dollar 8.3 billion, whereas greenhouse gas mitigation have got 193 billion US dollars, so many times more than CCA. I think in China, CCA is especially, it wasn't a key part of the national climate change policy in China until early 2010s. Remember the timeline where China really started taking strong action on, in particular, renewable energy development from 2005. And not until many years later where China really integrated CCA into their national policy agenda. One of the key reasons is that climate CCA is not so closely related to economic growth, whether we talk about the traditional growth model or new growth model. And even if we have anything that might contribute to CCA, in China in the past, they were mostly framed and managed as a matter of disaster risk and emergency management, rather than being framed as CCA. All right. In early years, it's quite easy to understand why they tend to call it, for example, flooding in terms of natural disaster, natural, so nothing to do with the government's fault. But when you frame it as CCA, climate change mitigation, and if you trace back to the original root of the whole problem, then you got to go back to China, contributed to a large share, like 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. So initially, there was some resistance to focusing on climate change adaptation. This has changed a little bit. About 10 or 12 years ago, 2013, there was one major climate change policy strategy published, which is the National Strategy for Climate Change Adaptation. This is important as a rhetoric, because remember mentioned in 2007, China started publishing the annual climate change report. At that time, CCA was just a small part of the climate change policy strategy. But from this year, one of the major milestones was a standalone climate CCA policy strategy. So a very important signal that China is going to take it more serious than before. So it is a key policy framework separate from greenhouse gas emissions. There have been several major policy programs, not as many and important as renewable energy or greenhouse gas emissions, but those are relatively significant and comparing to the previous decade without much action on CCA. For example, they call it sponge cities. 60 Chinese cities, I think it's actually more than 60, perhaps 80 or even 100 if I remember correct. So there are several rounds of sponge cities program coordinated by the central government with financial support from the central since 2013. Another important is commercial. I have to emphasize commercial catastrophe insurance system since 2014. China, like many other countries, has their own agriculture insurance system, which covers many natural disasters. But firstly, it focuses on agriculture instead of more broadly covering some other natural disasters not directly related to agriculture, for example, heat wave in the cities. Secondly, the agriculture insurance system was pretty much heavily subsidized by the government, where here we talk about commercial or an attempt to commercialize. I said attempt because it's not been very successful in commercializing the insurance system, but at least they tried it. And then another more urban sort of initiative, 28 climate adaptive cities since 2017. These are some examples of major nationwide policy programs supporting CCA. Now, it's quite clear, public spendings on CCA have increased by quite a large amount, sort of a proportion. But I did research and you found some sort of more details from official statistic. I found something interesting, still positive, but maybe a little bit different from what we see from those numbers presented by the government. Yeah, so that is the truth that I mentioned. So sometimes we do need to look at the details. Not going to talk about all these sort of items here, but those are related to CCA, not exactly about CCA, because those numbers are never sort of be, labeled as CCA, but they are closely related, such as flood control. So if you look at the directions, obviously most of them are going up. These are the central government public expenditure from 2012, so just 1 year before the national CCA strategy was published. So over a 10-year period, they all increased. But remember, at the same time, the same period, the central government's total budget has increased dramatically, and that is the smaller graph on the top left. So if you just look at the number, you can see it's more than perhaps 80%, I think. Probably not double, but it should be maybe close to double. All right. And then if you calculate sort of the proportion of these 5 CCA related expenditure items as a proportion of the total budget, you will get what I've put down here at the bottom left. Is actually decreasing. All right. So in terms of the absolute amount of expenditure increasing, in terms of the proportion of the total budget, at least in the first several years after 2012, it was declining. More recently bouncing back, and hopefully it will really to go back to the original level. But if you just look at this picture, it doesn't really look good, because it means the government actually has more money in the pocket, but spending less, relatively less on CCA. It's not like, it's actually the same. I did also look at the energy related, so greenhouse gas mitigation related expenditure is also diminishing, just like what we saw here. But the thing is that, don't forget, it's not just the government investing in greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas mitigation, but also the private sector. There are a lot of private investment into greenhouse gas mitigation, whereas CCA doesn't really attract a lot of private investment. So mostly investors supported by the government. All right, that's the difference. Exactly why CCA doesn't really get a lot of private investment, they actually tried. For example, the Sponge City approach program includes some initiative to encourage PPPs, public-private partnership. So encouraging local government to work with the private sector, and obviously that means attracting private investment into CCA. It's not been successful. All right. Reasons. I think it has something to do with the nature of CCA as well as the system as well. The nature of CCA is different from renewable energy, for example. The benefits of CCA remained, for example, reducing the risk of flooding, reducing the number of people suffering or even dying from drought, heat waves, this kind of benefit. Uncertain, because you have to have the natural disaster occurring in order to know how much you can benefit. Obviously, you can do some predictions, modeling, but there's still a lot of uncertainties. And the benefits are difficult to capture. And that's why when I look at the sponge city PPPs, many of them are actually based on service payment, which means that the private investor will get a fixed amount of payment based on some indicators, such as the capacity for recycling and utilizing wastewater. It's quite difficult to capture. Unlike renewable energy, solar panels, you know how much renewable energy you generate. You can get exactly amount of money based on a fixed rate. And the CCA benefits are much more dispersed, unlike renewable energy. If you put solar panel on your rooftop, all the benefits go to you. But it's not the case in CCA, it's much more dispersed. Long-term benefit, so planning time frame usually 20 years, 10 years. So there are high investment risks, discouraging private investment. So outcomes, local government, like I mentioned, they receive a political mandate to do reduce their climate change risk, and they have to sort out the money, and they can only borrow money from banks, and resulting in relatively higher local government debt. So it's not nice. So after sort of talking about CCA and greenhouse gas mitigation, I think I will spend a couple minutes about what I think about the future or what other people found. First of all, starting from good news, is that people based on data and statistics believe that China's greenhouse gas emissions have already reached the highest point, already peaked, which is what we have been waiting for. Good thing. Another thing is what I believed, that China will continue to promote their clean technology developments as a main driver of the economic transition, whereas CCA might be overshadowed because it is less growth compatible. There are some uncertainties, however, with, for example, the US sort of new tariffs under the new government reshaping international trade flows. Many solar panels go to US and now blocked. Same for Europe, raising concern about the cheap solar panels from China. So China is planning to shift or to sell their clean technologies to some emerging economies. So that's what we've got from the news headline at the bottom. But still uncertain because you don't know whether those new emerging markets are able to absorb all the supply, all the capacity from China. So politics, the United States withdraw from many sort of global sort of governance initiatives, including the Paris Agreement. And many people believe that it's going to be a good opportunity for China sort of to step up, to take up global leadership in climate change, forming new allies, forming sort of new alliances with US allies, not just in climate, but also in other areas. So it's kind of like creating an opportunity for China to seek global leadership in climate change. So this is something China has been doing for decades, not just one decade. It's just happened to be a good timing with the US sort of reversing their sort of climate change policy. So, so I would expect China becoming more active in sort of, international climate negotiations, hopefully. So many favorable conditions all come together now, but there are still uncertainty and challenges. Barriers to tech export, as I mentioned, it might be a little bit hard for China even sort of to sell to emerging markets. And also internally within China, their local economy is actually deteriorating. So they are experiencing a very sort of difficult situation in the economy. So they might not be able to afford significant investment, especially in the private sector. And the government, because of the economic difficulties, is now very keen to promote building new infrastructure. Many of those new infrastructures are likely to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. However, I think the good news that I showed you earlier, it looks like it's not as bad as we thought, even with those increase in infrastructure spending. And with all those uncertainties, challenges, China has actually recently expressed some hesitation about taking stronger action. So I did say China has been sort of showing strong commitments, but I was talking about over the last 2 decades. So more recent, 1 or 2 years, I think there is a bit of hesitation. So it's kind of like holding back a little bit in the terminologies they used, the way that they articulate the case for taking action. So politically, there's still some sort of things that we are not quite sure, even with sort of such a long time of commitment. So conclusion, end of 2000 shifting conditions for taking strong action. And then 2010, there were a lot of large-scale nationwide policy programs. From now on, we see clearer goals, but at the same time, the outcomes are still uncertain. We can still see very strong commitment at the high level, but at the same time, we also see at some circumstances they're holding back a little bit. So before I finished, talk a little bit about myself. I'm going to publish a new book exactly on the topic that I just talked about, pretty much covering all the key topics. I'm working with someone in Shanghai, and the book, China's Climate Policy, is due to be published by Edward Elgar in October this year. Another initiative within our university, I'm setting up and also leading a new research group on sustainability. So I think I should pause here. Thank you for coming to my presentation.
Couple of questions. Fascinating. Thank you. Helen. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. It's not my topic at all. I'm really interested in slum cities.
Okay.
I understand the idea that obviously it's to capture water and help the runoff and make sure it's avoiding flooding and drought. I'm wondering if in those cities it's helping biodiversification and if it's helping because the retention of water and it's adding to plants, the wildlife. But my context for the question is thanks to Rob, I visited China last October from Beijing down, and everywhere we went, I heard about slum cities that I hadn't heard before. There seemed to be quite a lot of interest and support in those developments. I'm just wondering the wider impact of them.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I obviously focus on climate change sort of benefit of those slum city. But in the local context within China, I think they don't just sort of look for those climate change benefit. And in fact, as I mentioned, many of those benefits are uncertain. In practice, I think they also sort of selling those sponge city infrastructure, not just for climate flooding, stormwater management, but also, for example, most of the those initiatives involve green infrastructure, building urban parks, and sort of many of those are sort of visible and look green. So it's on one hand aesthetics, beautiful cities, on the other hand, as you mentioned, biodiversity. So those are part of the picture and also part of the strategy. So yeah, but obviously when they sell it, especially because they need to get investment from the central government, and there's reason why they call it sponge city. But in practice, if you come down to the sort of a local area, you will see those sort of not just contributing to a CCA, but also wider sort of a environmental benefit. Now, some of those non-climate benefit can be sort of a turn into sort of a material benefit. For example, if you build urban parks next to a residential buildings, it might sort of increase the sort of property prices. So potentially, the local council and also the private investor will be able to capture the benefit. But there are also some other benefits that are not so sort of visible, not easy to capture, biodiversity, for example. So that's why I think they are still sort of focusing on those visible benefits. And for those non-visible, I think it's part of their strategy, but they're not probably not selling it, especially when it comes to what I mentioned, the PPPs. Investor look for economic return, financial returns, and sometimes it's quite hard to sell. But I don't know whether it's a fortunate or not, because they don't actually get a lot of private investment. So it turns out it's actually the government supporting it, and the government might have a different plan. They might want to support biodiversity. So yes, I think quick question is that I think it's part of the strategy.
It's fascinating. Is nuclear power a significant component of the low carbon energy going forward? Is there much work on fusion?
Sorry, is UK?
Nuclear.
Oh, nuclear. Now, I did look at statistics. So if you compare nuclear power with other, like for example, fossil fuels and renewable energy, it's not significant number. If I remember correct, in the energy mix, I think it's single-digit percentage. However, even though it's a small proportion, but I think last time I looked at the data, at least a couple of years ago, I saw an increase, a small increase in nuclear power generation as a proportion of the energy mix. But it was a couple of years ago. I didn't check sort of the most updated data. But my feeling is that it's still part of the picture. It's still part of the energy mix. It will never go. I think in short term, like 5 years, I think the best we can expect is not to have those nuclear power growing, capacities growing. So if you want them sort of come down, I think it might take longer, especially if China is being very ambitious in controlling, managing their renewable greenhouse gas emissions. I think they might not want to fully rely on renewable energy because, renewable energy sometimes is unstable. It depends on, for example, weather, something that they do not have full control, where nuclear power is something they have better control. So it won't go in short term, perhaps not even 10 years, but I won't expect a significant increase in the proportion in the energy mix.